Hello, and welcome to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast, your serving of drinks culture and the people who drive it. I'm Lauren Buzzeo, the managing editor at Wine Enthusiast, and in this episode, we're talking about a somewhat nebulous topic in the wine world. Is wine art? So much talk about wine romanticizes about the art and the poetry of its creation, but it's simultaneously impossible to ignore the science behind its production. In this episode, I talked to winemaker and vineyard manager Rachel Rose of Bryn Mawr Vineyards, located in the Eola Amity Hills near Salem, Oregon, about the reality of making wine and if it can truly be considered art or is really more of a science-based commodity. But first, a word from today's sponsor. There's a sizzling lineup of cool sips at Total Wine & More. We're talking summer's greatest hits you'll want to put on repeat, like our top 12 wines under $15. And you can raise a glass to America with a star-spangled selection of pours made in the USA. Next, do yourself a flavor with ready-to-freeze cocktail pops and fun, fizzy hard seltzers. Pineapple? Mango, anyone? Here's our recipe for a delicious summer evening. Take warm weather, smoked ribs, and just add Bordeaux. Let your imagination go grill crazy. From good old-fashioned hot dogs to turkey burgers with all of the toppings, you can't go wrong with Chardonnay. And when it comes to seafood, salmon and tuna swim nicely with fruity and fresh reds. So, no matter if you're cooking out or chilling in, you're sure to find cool prices on over 8,000 wines, 4,000 spirits, and 2,500 beers, in-store or at TotalWine.com. So every year, Wine Enthusiast releases an issue that's centered around the concept of the intersection of wine and culture. And what do we mean by culture? It's basically different interpretations of various art forms, whether it's visual art or film or music. But we always end up having this conversation about the question of if wine itself is art. Because we all know that there's a lot of science and a lot of technical savvy that goes into actually producing the bottles that we know and we love and we drink on a regular basis. But yet, so much talk about wine romanticizes the art and the poetry of its creation. But again, it's simultaneously impossible to ignore the science behind its production. So, in this episode, we really wanted to dive into this existential conversation, if you will, to talk about, is wine art? And we have the pleasure of being joined today by winemaker and vineyard manager Rachel Rose from Bryn Mawr Vineyards out in Oregon to talk about the reality of making wine and if it can be truly considered art or more of a science. So, Rachel, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So let's kick this off by telling me a little bit about how you came to the wine world, because I think you have such an interesting background. And again, I think it's perfectly suited to this overall conversation that we're looking to have. So, how did you get into winemaking?
Yeah, well, I got into wine by way really of my love of the culinary world as well as my background in science. So I could say right now I'm putting a pin in my beginning journey into the wine world by going all the way back to Santa Cruz, California. I lived there while I was studying molecular cellular developmental biology. So I am by training a scientist and a total nerd. Um, so I began my formal education really thinking I was going to be a researcher.
Mhm.
Um, After college, I started working in the biotechnology field. I actually worked in immunology, um,
Mm.
and it was very, very interesting, and I liked it. However, I just had this nagging sense that it wasn't going to be fulfilling enough for me. And kind of, it was also happening about that time. So I was in the it's this fruitful valley of California. So fresh produce was abundant, amazing farmers markets, and I really just started to follow what was happening all around me in the culinary scene, in the restaurants, and then of course, where there's food, there's wine, and so um, I just started exploring wine. Like, we had great markets with great wine sections, and I would just talk to the wine stewards. I'd have my like fillet of whatever I was doing, and I'd just be like, "Hey, what goes with this?" So I just really just started at this very basic point on my in my spare time, and it's just as a pleasure. And then I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive. And so I decided to spend my weekends working for the original Bonnie Doon. So in Bonnie Doon, Santa Cruz, California. So I actually started working in the tasting room, and I was just blown away by like the obscure varietals and all these weird, wacky wines. And one of the most pivotal points along this early discovery was when we had someone come in from the wine cellar who was going to tell us all about the new releases, and he brought like a little vial of unfinished wine. I think it might have been a tank or barrel sample, or in a few of them, and just started explaining to us in the tasting room all about like how this wine was made, and like talking about yeast and bacteria. And at that moment, I just was like floored, because up until that point, I hadn't really realized that there was science involved. I just thought about like geography and growing plants and grapes. I hadn't really thought about like fermentation kinetics and cell division and all of these things that were so much more familiar to me at that point. But that was also the moment where I'm like, I can do this. Maybe this feels a little closer to home. So that was just a real aha pivotal moment for me. And from there, I kind of played around with wine a little bit more. I took some online classes through UC Davis, and that covered winemaking as well as wine regions. And I'm like, whoa, this is history, this is geography, this is science, this is sensory examination. Whoa, this is huge. And I took my deep dive when I decided to get on a plane. Well, I did apply to school before that, but essentially I decided to embark in a professional wine career when I took a plane to Australia, and I actually went down under to receive my master's degree in enology, so the chemistry of winemaking. And while I was there, I started by studying viticulture, because of course that makes the most sense, where of course you got to study the grapes to know how to make wine. Um, that just seemed like the most obvious thing to me. However, as I clearly became to understand that there were and can be two separate camps of viticulturalists and winemakers.
Right.
So anyways, I do have a bachelor's of science in molecular cellular developmental biology, and I have a post-baccalaureate degree in viticulture and grape growing. So that's grape growing, and a master's degree in enology. Um, so that's the academic side of this journey and how I got into it. How I came to be at Bryn Mawr, well, that's kind of a different story. I really fell in love with cool climate varietals when I lived in Adelaide. So I was just really, really loving the Pinot Noir and the Chardonnay, and especially the Riesling, especially from the Clare Valley. So I worked in New Zealand, and I came and I worked in Oregon because I was really seeking more cool climate growing conditions, and I just found myself um, wanting to move to France. Unfortunately, the visas were a little hard to get, so I decided to go to the New World Burgundy, which is Oregon, and then I worked for Ponzi, and I also worked for Penarash, and kind of going back and forth between the Northern Hemisphere in Oregon and the Southern Hemisphere in New Zealand and Australia, until finally I found this cute, well, it wasn't cute then. I found this lovely vineyard to really get to exercise all of the things that I had been studying and learning and apprenticing to do. Some charismatic owners who had big ideas for the future. And it was very humble beginnings, though. There was an old rundown mobile home that I called home for a number of years. The property came with some roosters. I got to practice all my tractor driving, and yeah, it's pretty different compared to how we have grown, and the new winery we've built, and our beautiful new destination tasting room and winery. Definitely have come from humble basement beginnings, but now I find myself making some. I get to make wine in a brick and mortar winery.
That's awesome. And it sounds like in the process, you got so much experience, and experience that I think it sounds like you were yearning to have, and really to, be an active participant and to touch every element of the winemaking phase and process, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think anyone who's run a small business, and especially a wine business, knows that you pretty much do everything. And so I used to run the tractors, run the crew. Yeah, I mean, I'd be the crew leader and then work in the winery in the afternoon and then sell wine. Yeah, pretty much every hat there is I've worn here for Bryn Mawr.
So it sounds like you found the hats and the things that were maybe calling you way back when you were thinking, is there more for me? When you were just in the sort of science and biology field, you found that in wine and in winemaking. I love that.
I most definitely did, and more.
But it's really cool that it sounds like you came to the industry with one or not one, but a very specific perspective, and that being very focused on the science and the technical aspect of the wine industry. And then maybe we're exposed to a little bit more of what I was saying earlier, that romance and that poetic, language surrounding the wine world and consumption. So did it bite you, like, from first, steps on the vineyard?
Yeah, I've always loved the vineyard. And the winemaking is just kind of its extension in a way. It's kind of how I view the whole thing. Um, but I think to get into this whole question of, is wine art, I'm really excited to have this conversation. And I can tell you, I'm so happy that you sent me an email letting me know what we were going to talk about.
Yeah.
So I had time to think about it. This was some great dinner time conversation over the weekend, because so my husband, who works slash exists in the virtual and acoustic art world, I'll put it
Mm.
that way. We had a lot of fun talking about this late on Saturday. So to get into it, so this is I think where I stand. 2021 on this
Let's do
topic.
it. Yeah.
So
Get into it.
yeah, so right. So the question is wine art? Well, in order to even start that discussion, we have to talk about what art is.
Right.
I mean, we have to define what art is. And that, of course, is a huge debate in and of itself. Who gets to decide what's art and what's not art? Um, but I kind of feel like in order for something to be called art, it has to occupy a space that allows for some kind of mental or emotional space.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I can even add some kind of enhancement
Mm-hmm.
to that physical space or an emotional space. So it's it's got to be able to provoke thought or an emotional response to be art. That's kind of what I would consider to be art to begin with. And I would say to give pleasure is an emotional response as well.
Right.
So I think it's something when we talk about art, I feel like most people go to visual art and we're kind of thinking of like a canvas, right? And we're going, is this art? Is this art? Is this not art? But the romance of it, of course, is the end product because that's provoking emotion or thought. But there is absolutely a component of skill to art. You
Hmm.
absolutely must possess technical skill to be an artist and to produce art. Because you can have all the fantastic ideas in the world, but if you have no means of representing them, then you're lost. I kind of feel like maybe a better way to frame, for me at least, thinking about wine as potentially an artistic outlet or as a piece of art itself is to kind of think about more like music, where I think it's more clear the skill that's required. Whereas sometimes with visual art, people can look at like abstract art and be like, whatever, that doesn't take any skill. But with audio or acoustic art, it's very clear to me at least that you have ideas as a songwriter, but yet you absolutely must possess the skill set in order to bring that idea or that concept to fruition. So, that's kind of where I would like to start with it, is defining what art is, or at least what I think art is.
Yeah, no, that's a great place to start, and it's definitely something I was thinking about as well. So I think we're on the same, similar wavelengths in that I guess the place that I landed is I something considered art would be something that involves the use of your senses. Whether it's like we were talking about visual art, obviously using your eyes and your sense of sight, whether it's music and sense of sound and audio. And certainly with wine, with food, they call it the culinary arts. So with wine, you're using your sense of taste, but beyond that and using the senses, you're right, the absorption of that and the way that you unpack that and think about it, based on your own enjoyment, your own pleasure and interpretation of that experience, your personal interaction with it. It is to me what maybe would consider something to be art or not, having that element of a personal unique interpretation of a product.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the way that I pin that is that art must have an audience.
Right.
And so someone must receive that, and someone must have an emotional or sensory reaction to it, because without that individual or that person, then of course it's not art. It's like a few different moving parts here, because, and then that part about, in order to be art, it has to have an audience to interact with. I think that could be also like, is that individual capable of having something like wine be thought provoking? Can a certain individual be, well, what can they actually be, do they actually receive pleasure from wine? Can they perceive the same sensory components to a wine? I mean, I think about whether or not we're talking about an individual who may have, um, problems with smell. So, would it be art for that person? Or conversely, maybe someone who does not drink wine for pleasure or conversation or for thought, but maybe someone just looking to be intoxicated. Well, maybe it's not art for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's like there's a few different moving targets here. There's like, okay, what is the piece that is art, and then who is the receiver, and are they able to either mentally or physically be stimulated by it, right?
Right. And is that desire even there? Which is a really good point that, you and I talking about this, or, the editors and wine enthusiasts or various winemakers talking about this. Of course, we have, a deep passion and love of wine. We want to know everything about it. We want to think about it. We want to talk about it all the time. But that's probably not the truth for everybody out there. Some people might just, want to kick back with their glass at the end of the day, maybe feel a little bit of the effects and, move on with their life.
Yeah. Or gosh, I mean, or even people who have like lost their sense of taste or smell.
Right,
So
right,
does that bottle of wine cease to be art
right.
because the person consuming them can't perceive it?
Yeah, absolutely. The accessibility question, and how everybody's coming to the table with their different perspectives and different abilities. I think another element of that is talking about the packaging. We'll go back to the winemaking maybe in a minute, but as
Yeah.
we're talking about the different senses and access points for what could be considered art, packaging and wine packaging is definitely a part of that. So for you, how important do you think that is to get across this feeling, this impression of what the bottle holds?
Oh, as much as I want to say it doesn't matter and it shouldn't matter, um,
It does.
it does. But the other part of my brain absolutely geeks out on wine packaging. So I get to make 1 to 2 wines each year under what's called the Innovation Series. And they're wines where I just get to just let loose and come up with ideas or get to try out new varietals, different techniques. And every year the bottle has a brand new label redesign.
Cool.
And it's a lot of work, but I have a ton of fun doing it. I mean, this year I am so pumped on these wines. I mean, I had so much fun picking the different foil colors to match the artwork. I even got some awesome bottle wax that matched. I mean, put so much work into it, but I really do love it. And I do think it's part of it because it's kind of like the cereal box effect. Like most people leave the bottle of wine on the table and they look at it. And you know, you want to be visually stimulated as well. So
Absolutely. Just like plating for food, that's the first impression that you get right there. And you want it to be pleasing and attractive. You want it to ignite that excitement and stimulate your senses. And visually, that's the first chance you get before someone even tastes what's inside of the bottle. So I feel you. And, and I feel your desire to want to say it's not that important. But I think we all know that it really is.
it really
Um,
is.
and I think it's also interesting because it ties into a little bit of what you were talking about before in terms of your excitement in considering that there are so many different elements to winemaking and what goes into it. And that includes, regionality and different terroir and also the history. So I think there's another romantic element to wine, if you will, in that also perpetuates this idea of it being art, in that it's possible that it's an expression and capable of capturing a moment in time, in that individual bottle, or even a few bottles, a period style that translates to current trends. There's another layer that's parallel to what we see in different art forms, like in visual art, different eras of style and production, that wine is capable of doing that and offering that time capsule as well.
Yes, absolutely. It can. And I think that's perfectly aligns with kind of this. I would say, like, my third concept about this is that it's like, well, what kind of wine are we talking about here?
Right.
Are we talking about homogenous, year to year, strict protocol, um, mixed appellation, mixed, blended out differentiation?
Mm-hmm.
Or are we talking about more, I'll call it observatory, like where you're observing what's happening in your microclimate, or you're more reactive as a winemaker and you're trying to showcase something inherent about the land or the
Right.
grapes. And it's much more respective, I would say, of
Mm.
the land and the grapes. So, so if we're talking about, I think, what is considered to be fine wine, I think that this discussion can be a little easier.
Yeah.
Because, and not to say that you can't make large scale wine on a large scale that can be respective of place and style, but I think that more often than not we see that with the perhaps smaller producers and or styles of wine, right?
Right. Yeah, because I think the argument would be that there is definitely a ton of technical skill, and I would venture to say an art form for a winemaker to create a consistently styled offering, a la non-vintage champagne, um, year after year after year. That's hard work. And that
Yeah.
is an art form in and of itself. But I do agree that I think generally when we're talking about this, again, this sort of overly like romanticized wine as art concept, it is sort of easier to apply it to, you know, whatever you consider fine wine, styles, bottlings, and even I wonder, regions. I mean, you talked about maybe some more like micro terroir or microclimate, hyper specific bottlings. Do you think that they're maybe more inclined to be expressive in that kind of way as an art form?
Well, I think kind of where I was going with that is, as a producer, if you are inclined to maintain those differences and to respect them or accentuate them, then that is going to be different than if you're trying to make a uniformly styled wine year in, year
Right.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it could be said for vintage. I think it
Mm,
could be said for region. I think it could be said for if a producer is trying to keep distinctness, varietal distinction.
hmm.
So any one of those points, if it's a key tenet of the winemaking to really try to augment or change their winemaking to bob and weave with those characteristics, then I think you're finding your way more into the artistic realm, I would say.
Right.
Whereas
So
if you're
we've
just following
mm,
a recipe, for example, like if you're just following a protocol and it doesn't matter where the grapes come from or what they taste like, you're just following a protocol for making the wine, then I would say that would be in the not so artistic realm.
right. So I love this because you're venturing into sort of elements of winemaking that you would say might be considered more artistic and creative, as opposed to those that are more, scientific and based in numbers and analysis and reads and technical data? Um, so what, I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what elements of winemaking would you consider to be more artistic and creative as opposed to those that are more grounded in science?
Um, well, I can only speak from my own process.
Sure.
Um, but I've got a few different ways I approach making a wine. Um, I'll consider a wine that I've never made before. So that's probably the most easy to kind of walk through because I do it now every single year. So that begins in a very creative place. In that I need inspiration. I often try to taste wines outside my normal, not comfort level, but just wines that I don't normally drink. And I sometimes am just struck with something and I'm like, wow, I really, really like something about this wine, whether it's the wine style or the aroma or just whatever it is. So I would say that whenever I'm working on developing a wine, I start in a very creative place. It kind of has that same warm, buzzy, fuzzy feeling as like a really good idea.
Uh-huh.
So that's when I know I'm in that hemisphere of my brain.
Love
Um,
it.
and I'm visualizing as well. I'm imagining what that wine texture would be like. I'm thinking about maybe the varietals I want to work with to achieve certain aromas, or maybe sometimes I'm working with a set of grape varietals that I know I want to work with, and then I start envisioning how those blends will come together, and it's all just creative thought.
This is very artistic sounding. It's like you're building a palette and figuring out the color scheme that you want to put on the canvas, and yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and but it's mental. I also take notes about things that are like, oh, like for example, I mean to really, really get I'm good better with examples. So I had always wanted to make an orange wine since probably about 2011.
Hmm.
And so one of the first wines I made at the Innovation Series was a wine that ended up being called an amber. We called it amber.
Hmm.
And that started because I was like, okay, the thing that I like about some of these orange wines are the phenolics, but I don't want it to be quite as aggressive. So I want like a soft, weighty palette. And then I was like, what varietals can I work with? Because I want prettier, more delicate aromatics. Ooh, so I'm going to work with Pinot Gris. Okay. And what do I want to do to give a beautiful floral lift? And I'm like, oh, maybe I can get some muscat. And so it's kind of like developing maybe a recipe or something in
Mm-hmm.
your mind, but it's always going to come back to sensory of what I'm looking for. And so once I have the concept down, then I actually do get pretty technical. I then write myself a kind of flowchart protocol. I go into my press cycles. I figure out approximately so for this particular wine, I knew that I really wanted a softer palate than anything I'd ever tasted in an orange wine. And so how do I get from that concept to how the wine actually tastes? Well, that's where the technical aspect and that's where the skill comes in. And there were a number of pivotal decisions made between point A and point Z that that influence that ultimate vision. And I can tell you they were all very technical in origin in that I I said, well, I'm going to need to take press fractions. So I'm going to need 3 tanks for this wine. Okay, how am I going to get 3 tanks? Okay, well, I'll have to do some logistics there. Okay, next point. Okay, I'm only going to take it up to 0.8 bar. Okay, how many rotates am I going to do? Well, let's go back. Let's look at some old records. Let's maybe taste some old wines. Oh, okay, with this wine, I'm not going to roll the press at all. Okay, moving right along. Am I going to barrel ferment this? Or do I want 100% full contact? Oh, okay. Well, actually, I am going to barrel it down while it's still fermenting. Okay, next step. Okay, what kind of barrels am I going to use? Well, I really, really want good tannin integration. So, should I use puncheons? No, not enough oxygen transmission rate. Am I going to use Burgundies? Nah, I'm afraid of a little too much wood. Oh, I've got those old cognac barrels I can use. Oh, perfect. Okay. And so I'm taking all these tools and using them. And it's so funny trying to explain to people what kind of winemaker I am, because I have a really hard time with that, because I am a very meticulous winemaker.
Yeah.
And especially with my white wines, there are certain things that need to be done at certain points. However, the part that maybe slips in as artistic during the making of wine for me, or maybe this is technical, I don't really know, but like when you taste a wine that is in process and it's not what you think it should be, it's deciding whether or not you're okay with that transgression and that it's actually working, and you can visualize and see a space for that.
Right.
Or you are like, nope, gonna get it in line, gotta get it back to how I planned. And so at each little micro fissure of the winemaking process, and frankly, there are so many decisions to be made. The more you think about it, the more there are. There's an infinite amount of decisions that can be made, and it's only limited by your bandwidth to think of those questions. So that in and of itself is, I think, also kind of creative, because you have to be able to access that part of your brain and not just shut off ideas. But also just decision making in and of itself. Is decision making artistic, or is decision making technical?
Which is super interesting to me, because if I think about, a hot topic right now, which is natural wines and, the creation of the winemaking that goes into natural wines, and people thinking that they're more authentic, possibly, or potentially more artistic creations. But hearing, your experiences, and you talk about the process and actually the thought that goes into each step of that process, it kind of juxtaposes what might be assumed, vis-a-vis natural wine being a more, again, creative or authentic expression in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. That is definitely a whole another very, very existential conversation. Oh my gosh. That one just keeps me up. Yeah. So, I think
So tell me, do you think natural wine is art?
Oh, you were trying to get me in trouble.
This podcast just got real good.
Oh my God.
No, I'm kidding. You
Oh,
don't have to answer. We
oh,
could save it for another time. We could
yeah.
save.
Woo! That one could get hot.
But I had to point it out, just based on everything that you're saying, that the more you're only limited, the creativity and the process, you're only limited by what you know and the steps that you take throughout the process, and the questions and the considerations that you want to dive into along that timeline, and all of the breakouts and fissures, as you said, that can happen throughout that process, which again was just like, it just clicked for me. That's super interesting based on the way that I think a lot of people perceive natural wines. But we can move on from there. So, so at the end of the day, tell me, do you generally consider your wines as art or as a scientific, a product?
It takes both. It absolutely takes both, because without the artistic, creative vision, you cannot make interesting wine, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
But without technical skill, you cannot see that to its end. You absolutely have to have both. It's both. It's both.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've answered the question. Is wine art? Yes, but not exclusively. The answer may be that it is science-based art, but it is still art nonetheless.
Yes, I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
Well, I think we've landed at a beautiful place here. So I love this answer, because it means that maybe it's okay when people like to overly romanticize wine and wine consumption and use this sort of flowy, ethereal, beautiful language to describe the wine. I'm guilty of it myself. I think we all are, because it's that passion that comes out, right? And you're just so
Yeah.
excited and stimulated by it. So, but that's very much how people describe art and things that they are passionate about and that have sparked that inside of them. So I think it's safe to say that we can continue to use that type of language around wine.
Yes. And I mean, it's so hard because, like, with visual art, nobody talks about the artist that well, maybe they do talk about this. It is kind of romanticized with artists that they can just be kind of crazy mad hatters and stay up until all hours of the night. But they maybe don't talk about art school, and maybe they don't talk about meticulously selecting palette colors and drawing and redrawing lines, or some of the actual skill that is required behind the scenes of creating a beautiful piece of visual art.
That's true. The process is not necessarily part of the conversation for people to enjoy or appreciate the art. But for some reason, that is kind of intertwined with wine and wine enjoyment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Rachel, I think that we've landed at a beautiful place. And, I love that we can continue to say that, wine is art, but there is science behind it. And I think that you've brought to light for a lot of people just how much science there is behind every step of production, from field to glass, for winemaking. So thank you so much for sharing all of your valuable insights and experiences with us. It was really a pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
So there you have it. Thanks to its stimulation of so many of our senses and the personal interaction and interpretation that each of us has with it, I think we've come to the conclusion that wine is art, though there's clearly a serious science-based technical skill needed to make those creative visions come to life. I am definitely ready to pop open a bottle of Rachel's stunning Riesling and appreciate all of the meticulous decisions she made to create that piece of art. And I hope that you can raise a glass to toast the art of your favorite winemaker too. Subscribe to the Wine Enthusiast podcast on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you liked today's episode, we'd love to read your review and hear what you think. And hey, why not tell your wine-loving friends to check us out too? You can also drop us a line at podcast@winemag.com. For more wine reviews, recipes, guides, deep dives, and stories, visit Wine Enthusiast online at winemag.com and connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Wine Enthusiast. The Wine Enthusiast podcast is produced by Lauren Buzzeo and Jenny Groza. Until next episode, cheers.